as you might remember, um, I'm doing my Princeton University Press haul in 4 installments. 3 weeks ago, I gave you installment 2, so here is installment 3, as promised. I think I have about 10 books here, and they all have one thing in common, and that is the publisher. They are all Zone books. I don't know if you're familiar with Zone books, but apparently every single book Zone has ever printed um, is available through Princeton University Press. So they are affiliated somehow. Maybe one bought out the other. I don't quite know how that works. But they all have this sort of Zone books thing. And they all tend to be on very highly academic subjects. So, I mean, even more like weird than I usually talk about. So, if that doesn't put anyone off, I hope I can share a few with you. This first one is by a book I found, oh gosh, probably 10 or 12 years ago, and read before I started reviewing books on this channel. It's called The Accursed Share, but it was only volume 1, and I knew there was a volume 2 and 3 out there. I didn't know that Zone Books had printed them as well, but they have. And here's volumes 2 and 3 in one book. This is volumes 2 and 3 of The Accursed Share by Georges Bataille, put up by Zone Books. Georges Bataille is considered The Accursed Share his radical critique of economic theories based on rational categories of need, scarcity, and utility, his most important project. In Volume 1, he announced 2 further volumes, The History of Eroticism and Sovereignty, but never finished them in book form. This Zone edition includes them in a single volume, and in a reconstruction of completed versions that publish his posthumous collected works. He expands on the notion developed in Volume 1 of an economics based not on the management of scarce resources, but on the exuberant consumption of excess production, what he calls the accursed share. In its final part, Bataille identifies eroticism as an ideal form of consumption, since in his view it is useless and purposeless. As an expenditure of excess energy, it demarcates the realm of human autonomy. The study of eroticism leads naturally to an examination of sovereignty, in which Bataille defines the sovereign individual as one who consumes and does not labor, creating a life beyond the realm of utility. So it's sort of a work of theoretical economics. Sure, that review is just going to bring in the viewers. They also have a series of books by a couple of writers I'm especially interested in, and the topics they write about I'm also interested in. And one of those writers is Jean-Pierre Vernant, the French classicist. And this is Myth and Thought. Myth and Thought Among the Greeks by Jean-Pierre Vernant. The ad matter that Princeton has for Myth and Thought is one long quotation from someone named Froma Zeitlin, who is the Charles Ewing Professor of Greek Language and Literature and Professor of Comparative Literature at Princeton. I'll just read you the quote. Myth and Thought Among the Greeks is Jean-Pierre Vernant's magisterial first entry upon the scene of classical studies. As fresh and challenging as it was when first published in 1965, this new edition of his 18 essays, which includes 2 previously untranslated chapters, will provide the English-speaking world with a long overdue edition. As the very words of the title announce, two major themes run throughout his path-breaking study. On the one hand, myth and thought suggest a certain transition from the mythic to the rational, from the fabulous to the philosophical, as an intellectual sea change that occurred within the social and political context of the Greek city-state. On the other hand, myth and thought also gesture to Vernon's insistence on the legibility of mythic thinking and ritual practices as revealing categories of thought that yield their own logic. Hence, to understand mental categories we take for granted as our own, such as time, space, memory, work, craft, art, and even the idea of the person, requires acts of decipherment through the language, the quote-unquote codes of myth. The excitement of these essays lies in a virtuoso handling of data of every sort: archaeology, history, literature, and iconography, and a complex web of associations that emerge from these interdisciplinary investigations, all presented in a lucid, readable prose. Myth and thought has much to offer the specialist and non-specialist alike, and to those not already familiar with Vernon's work, the promise of much more in store. So there's another book by Vernon. I learned about Jean-Pierre Vernon a long time ago when I was first sort of interested in not just Greek tragedy, but I guess the social, the cultural sort of background that made the tragedy so interesting and so timeless. You probably saw in Installment 2 that I held up a 900-page book on Sophocles. That's a sort of an explication of his plays and their cultural, social context. That's also sort of an extension of my endless fascination with Greek myth and Greek tragedy. But here's another book by Jean-Pierre Vernon, and they all sort of sound the same. This one is Myth and Society in Ancient Greece. And the ad matter for this just says, Jean-Pierre Vernon articulates a compelling new vision of ancient Greece. Myth and Society in Ancient Greece takes us far from the calm and familiar images of Polykleitos and the Parthenon to reveal a fundamentally other culture, one of slavery, of masks and death, of scapegoats, of ritual hunting, and of ecstasies. His provocative discussions of various institutions and practices, including war, marriage, and sacrifice, detail the complex intersection of the religious, social, and political structures of ancient Greece. The book concludes with Vernon's authoritative genealogy of the study of myth from antiquity to structuralism and beyond. Myth, he writes, brings into operation a form of logic, which we may describe, unlike the logic of non-contradiction of the philosophers, as a logic of the ambiguous and the equivocal. And here's the big one that he wrote with a fellow French classicist by the name of Pierre Vidal-Naquet. This is Myth and Tragedy in Ancient Greece by Jean-Pierre Vernon and Pierre Vidal-Naquet. This says, Vernon and Naquet are leaders in a contemporary French classical scholarship that has produced a stunning reconfiguration of Greek thought and literature. Here the authors present a disturbing and decidedly non-classical reading of Greek tragedy that insists on its radical discontinuity with our own outlook and with our social, aesthetic, and psychological categories. Originally published in French in 2 volumes, this is a new single-volume edition which includes revised essays from Volume 1, as well as the first English translation of Volume 2. And I promise only one more book on ancient Greece. This is The Masters of Truth in Archaic Greece by Marcel Detienne. Had never encountered this before. It looks like many of them were translated by the same person. The last 4 books were translated by the same person, Janet Lloyd. But I'm now sort of endlessly fascinated by his own books. I've only recently discovered how many they actually have. And now I kind of want almost all of them. So, The Masters of Truth in Archaic Greece traces the Odyssey of truth, what the Greeks referred to as aletheia, from mytho-religious to philosophical thought in Archaic Greece. Marcel Detienne's starting point is a simple observation that in Archaic Greece, 3 figures, the diviner, the bard, and the king, all share the privilege of dispensing truth by virtue of the religious power of divine memory, which provides them with knowledge, both oracular and inspired, of the past, present, and the future. Beginning with this definition of the pre-rational meaning of truth, Detienne proceeds to elaborate the complex conceptual and historical contexts from which emerges the philosophical notion of truth still influencing Western philosophy today. So that is all we have to say about ancient Greece and myth and stuff like that. Now, a few more. One more one author focus, but not quite yet. This is another book I've always wanted to get my paws on. Another one with these wonderful sort of color images. These zone books, if you can say anything about them, and I mean I think you can say wonderful things about them, they are made with some of the thickest, most lush paper. Really, really feels acid resistant, and the quality of the paper plates are really second to none, and they're not expensive either. So, especially when you get 75% off on them. But this is Lorraine Daston and Peter Gallison's Objectivity, another classic text in the history of philosophy. Excuse me, the history of science. This has a bit of a longer blurb as well. Objectivity has a history, and it is full of surprises. In Objectivity, Lorraine Daston and Peter Gallison chart the emergence of objectivity in the mid-19th century sciences and show how the concept differs from alternatives, truth to nature, and trained judgment. This is a story of lofty epistemic ideals fused with workaday practices in the making of scientific images. From the 18th through the early 21st centuries, the images that reveal the deepest commitments of the empirical sciences, from anatomy to crystallography, are those featured in scientific atlases, the compendia that teach practitioners of a discipline what is worth looking at and how to look at it. Atlas images define the working objects of sciences of the eye: snowflakes, galaxies, skeletons, even elementary particles. Galliston and Daston use atlas images to uncover a hidden history of scientific objectivity and its rivals. Whether an atlas maker idealizes an image to capture the essentials in the name of truth to nature, or refuses to erase even the most incidental detail in the name of objectivity, or highlights patterns in the name of trained judgment, is a decision enforced by an ethos as well as by an epistemology. As Daston and Gallison argue, atlases shape the subjects as well as the objects of science. To pursue objectivity, or truth to nature, or trained judgment, is simultaneously to cultivate a distinctive scientific self wherein knowing and knower converge. Moreover, the very point at which they visibly converge is in the very act of seeing not as a separate individual, but as a member of a particular scientific community. Embedded in the atlas image, therefore, are the traces of consequential choices about knowledge, persona, and collective sight. Objectivity is a book addressed to anyone interested in the elusive and crucial notion of objectivity, and in what it means to peer into the world scientifically. Okay, 4 more. I was very, very excited to find this too. If you go looking for writings by this guy, they are exorbitantly expensive. Never knew that Zone Books or Princeton offered this, but these are the history of science, philosophy of science, like sort of selected writings and essays by a man by the name of Georges Conway, that is titled A Vital Rationalist. Selected writings from Georges Conway, translated by François Delporte. Conway is one of France's leading philosophers and historians of science. He was trained as a medical doctor and as a philosopher, and he overlapped these practices to demonstrate that there could be no epistemology without the concrete study of actual development of the sciences, and no worthwhile history of science without a philosophical understanding of the conceptual basis of all knowledge. A Vital Rationalist brings together for the first time some of Conway's most important writing, including excerpts from previously unpublished manuscripts, organized around the major themes and problems that have preoccupied him throughout his intellectual career. This collection allows readers both familiar and unfamiliar with his work to access a vast array of conceptual and concrete meditations on epistemology, methodology, science, and history. Although Conway is a demanding writer, Delporte succeeds in identifying the main lines of his thought with unrivaled clarity, and maps out the complex and crucial place this thinker holds in the history of 20th century French thought. I know that, I don't know, I'm pretty sure that I first learned about Georges Conway in reading Foucault 15, 20 years ago, and tried to, I think that was the same time when I learned about Cornelius Kastidioris, and good luck trying to find English translations of those two until now. So very, very glad to have this eventually to get around. Okay, so I have one book by Carolyn Walker Bynum, that the one that she is perhaps best known for. It's oh goodness, of course they're not going to throw me a bone and tell me what it's called. From Feast to Fast, or something like that. It's about the significance of women in medieval fasting and eating rituals. Like I said, these books are very sort of, um, not for the general reader, but they had several of Carolyn Bynum Walker's books printed in the Zone book section, and this was one of them. It's called Christian Materiality, an essay on religion in late medieval Europe. In the period between 1150 and 1550, an increasing number of Christians in Western Europe made pilgrimage to places where material objects, among them paintings, statues, relics, pieces of wood, earth, stones, Eucharistic wafers, etc., allegedly erupted into life. These objects appeared animated. They wept, bled, and even talked. Such phenomena posed a challenge to Christians. On the one hand, they sought ever more frequent encounters with miraculous matter, and on the other hand, they turned toward an inward piety that rejected material objects of devotion. By the 15th century, these aspirations, accompanied by new anxieties and concerns, were at the heart of religious practice and polemic. In Christian Materiality, Carolyn Walker Bynum describes the miracles themselves, discusses the problem they pose to both church authorities and the ordinary faithful, and probes the basic scientific and religious assumptions about matter that lay behind them. Bynum also provides a deep analysis of the proliferation of religious art in the latter Middle Ages. Her argument is without precedent. Religious art, she says, in this context and time period, called attention to its own materiality in sophisticated ways that explain both the animation of images and the hostility toward them on the part of iconoclasts. Understanding the 14th and 15th centuries Christian culture as a paradoxical affirmation of the glory and the threat of the natural world, Bynum's study suggests a new understanding of the background of 16th century Reformations, both Protestant and Catholic. Moving beyond a cultural study of the body, a field she was crucial in establishing, Bynum exposes how Western attitudes towards the body and person must be placed in the context of changing assumptions about matter itself. Christian Materiality is a major contribution to the study and theory of material culture and religious practice. So, a book to add to my Carolyn Walker Bynum collection, one of my favorite living medievalists. And the last two books are two more books by her. This one is called Metamorphosis and Identity. Hold it up for you. No clumsy subtitle there, just Metamorphosis and Identity. This is the book where Carolyn Walker Bynum explores the Western obsession with the nature of change and personal identity, focusing on the 12th and 13th centuries, but concerned as well with antiquity and the 20th century. She confronts the question of why intellectuals, religious leaders, and ordinary people alike exhibited a precise and persistent desire to understand how the individual both changes and remains the same. Examining shifting conceptions of change during the years around 1200, Bynum situates the intense medieval curiosity about radical or substantial change in the context of specific cultural and social developments. Two images of change, hybridity and metamorphosis, were prominent in imaginative literature, theology, and the arts, and natural philosophy. These sites of compelling and shifting understandings each entailed different anthropological and psychological assumptions. As she demonstrates in the four essays that compose Metamorphosis and Identity, the fascination with boundary crossing and alterity reveals an effort across different genres to delineate the regularity of nature and to establish a strong sense of personal identity, perduring even beyond the grave. And there is actually one I didn't end up buying for whatever stupid reason. I'm going to go back and get it. But this is one of the books that she wrote on the body, the medieval understanding of the body. It's one of her sort of earlier works from 1991. This is called Fragmentation and Redemption. Essays on Gender and the Human Body in Medieval Religion by Carolyn Walker Bynum. Fragmentation and Redemption is first of all about bodies and the relationship of part to whole in the High Middle Ages, a period in which the overcoming of partition and putrefaction was the very image of paradise. It's also a study of gender, that is, a study of how sex roles and possibilities are conceptualized by both men and women, even though asymmetric power relationships and men's greater access to knowledge have informed the cultural construction of categories such as male and female, heretic and saint. Finally, these essays are about the creativity of women's voices and women's bodies. Bynum discusses how some women manipulated the dominant tradition to free themselves of the burden of fertility, yet made female fertility a powerful symbol. How some used Christian dichotomies of male and female, and powerful and weak, to facilitate their own imitatio Christi, yet undercut these dichotomies by subsuming them into humanitas. Medieval women spoke little of inequality and little of gender, yet there is a profound connection between their symbols and communities and the 12th century determination to speak of gender and to study women. So, I hope Installment 3 did not bore you too much with my own niche interests any more than I usually bore you with my own niche interests. But in 3 more weeks, I will finally put you out of your misery and show you the last and final installment number 4 of my Princeton University Press book haul. And then you'll never have to hear about Princeton University Press unless they offer another book sale next year, in which case I am afraid you might have to hear about them again. But unless that happens, not so much. And next week, I will be back with a book review. Talk to you later. Bye.